In order to understand Thomas Holloway's story, we must, again, move away from him and meet someone new, Felix Albinolo. An Italian leech vendor from Turin, not on the surface the kind of man you'd expect to change the course of British history. But in the mid-1830s, Felix Albinolo was making quite a name for himself across London. He was selling a story. Albinolo's product was an ointment. He called it St. Cosmas and St. Damian, based on the patron saints of medicine. But his most effective ingredient was not found in the ointment bottle. Rather, it was testimonials from doctors, from patients, from people who swore hand on heart that this ointment had changed their lives. This was the world of Victorian patent medicine, of course. Walk into any pharmacy in Britain in the 1830s and you'll find shelves lined with products making claims that no scientist would dream to touch. Remedies for everything and cures for just about anything. In what was known as the Age of the Quack Doctor, there were a number of these eccentric figures promising to cure any ailment. Felix was not alone. One product, called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, was even found to result in several child deaths. These were individuals who made great wealth built on the back of people who could not have known better. Often working class people who may have grown up desperate through their constant exposure to unpleasant conditions.
As cities crowded and sanitation measures failed to keep up, disease became even more rampant in Victorian London. Now, the major killers of this era were cholera, influenza, and typhoid. The most famous of these was probably cholera. It first arrived in England around 1831 and was quickly followed by successive epidemics in typhoid and in influenza.
Luckily, these quack doctors always had the answer, and it could be found in a neat little branded bottle, sometimes for quite a price. But these individuals were not concerned with whether or not their product worked. What they were concerned with was whether people believed they worked. And of all the people that were captivated by Felix's brand, one man patiently watched, growing ever more inspired. Thomas Holloway. Felix was everything Thomas wanted to be, a master storyteller, genius salesman, and deeply embedded in the world of patent medicine, a somewhat niche hero. But then, an opportunity arose. Felix Albinolo was on the hunt for an interpreter in London to expand his business even further. Thomas Holloway was an obvious choice. Thomas reignited his aspiration and climbed his way through the company internally, making a name for himself as being energetic and having a talent for marketing. It is evident that those days in Roubaix, those steely businessmen and bold paper advertisements were still deeply set in Thomas's mind. But he had not forgotten his Dunkirk days either. The late nights spent around the roulette wheel imprinted an excitement in him too, a thirst for risk. So Thomas took a gamble. He looked upon his hero, and now boss, and thought one thing. Perhaps I could do this better. The student was growing confident, and a new empire was emerging. Thomas Holloway returned to the family kitchen. Having split from Albinolo, he channeled the 16-year-old apprentice still left within him and embarked on an aggressive campaign to sell his own medicines. Initially, Thomas would go down to the docks and offer free samples of his latest cure-all, knowing that these were well-travelled men whose word would travel far, perhaps inspired by his days above that Penzance pub. After this, his next target was the housewives of the London terraces. His clean, tailored appearance made him stand out amongst the more eccentric quack doctors of the day, the Albinolos, if you will. Momentum was building. Thomas was no longer playing with dominoes. This was an avalanche.
Holloway's ointment and pills succeeded mainly in part to its advertising. Now, Holloway's pills invented an idea of blanket advertising. It didn't matter what kind of newspaper you were, it didn't matter where you were, Holloway wanted to advertise his pills. There are some recorded cases of him even walking into chemists, claiming to be suffering from aches, pains, fevers, and saying that only Holloway's pills could cure him. When the chemist didn't stock it, he would ask for them to stock it. And this was one way in which he was able to get his pills and ointments in chemists.
Next, adverts. Everywhere. Literally everywhere. No, seriously, everywhere. For some, this celebrity was magnetic. For others, it became somewhat irritating, leading to public criticisms from some high-profile individuals, such as Charles Dickens in 1851. Then, Thomas got creative. Bus adverts driving across the city and billboards in some bizarre places, such as in front of Niagara Falls and the Pyramids of Giza. These were things we may take for granted today, but Thomas was pushing them hard, all the way back then. Soon, London was covered in one word. But none of this was possible alone. For Thomas had a particularly special business partner, a partnership in the most literal sense. The Holloway pills and ointments empire was primarily run through his office at the Strand here in London. But Thomas was not the only Holloway behind the brand. His wife, Jane, born Jane Pierce Driver, was instrumental in ensuring operations ran smoothly and client demands were met. The two initially bonded over their shared passions for the arts and education, a mutual interest that would change the lives of thousands. This was an empire with two heads. Thomas and Jane were becoming very wealthy. In fact, at the height of his success, Thomas Holloway was worth tens of millions of pounds in today's money. However, just as Thomas's methods matched his ambition, they also matched some uncomfortable truths about 19th century British society. Beyond the large print posters lining the London walls, Holloway's ointments and pills advertised in a much subtler way. A new series of collectible trading cards were launched to the market, Holloway's Natural History series. These featured animals from across the world, creatures you'd rarely see in London unless you were at the zoo. Each card had an advert for the pills company on the back, literally placing Thomas's name in your pocket. But the company soon branched into a new series, Holloway's Sports and Pastimes of Many Nations. These cards featured highly racialized caricatures of foreign cultures, an attempt to bring the empire closer to home and make a little money doing it. One card, which is cared for by the Egham Museum, features a description of Turkish people as extremely indolent. This is one of many ways that Thomas made his money and reflects the mass commercial appeal of imperialism for consumers in Victorian Britain. However, production continued even into the 20th century. However, eventually, Thomas began to slow down. He could not go door to door and shop to shop forever. He had made his wealth, but had no children to inherit it. He and Jane had to decide what to do with all this money. But how could a man whose fame was dependent on the exploitation of the desperate and diseased pick where to put his funds? Thomas, at the age of 61, now a respected member of the London elite, a far cry from his community roots in the west of England, attended a meeting here at the Freemasons' Hall near Covent Garden. It would prove to be a particularly consequential session. Lord Shaftesbury, chairman of the so-called Lunacy Commission, made a speech on the increasing number of middle-class people suffering from mental health conditions. Thomas eagerly watched from the crowd, and in this hall behind me, another domino dropped. Thomas was inspired and made the effort to visit several asylums across the country. He was not impressed by their standards and conditions, And, just as he did when looking at his former boss, Felix Albanolo, Thomas said to himself, "I can do better than this."
He wanted it to be spacious, welcoming, comfortable. He wanted it to be an inspiration for others to follow.
Finances were not to be considered a hindrance. Thomas remarked that he was able to make money faster than he could spend it. £300,000 was allocated to the construction of his new asylum. And the name? Well, that too had his name all over it. Literally. But Thomas did not deal in smalls. A grand project deserved a grand architect, and so he hosted a competition for the best design. There was one man who seemed obvious for the task, and was even invited as part of a pre-selected list of candidates. His name? William Henry Crossland. Crossland was a celebrated architect, and described by those who knew him as a fine, quiet man. But his most famous work wasn't found down in leafy Surrey, but up in the industrial town of Rochdale, now in Greater Manchester.
This is Rochdale Town Hall, described by Historic England as one of the finest municipal buildings in the entire country. When it was first designed and built by Crossland in the 1870s, the clock tower was topped with a wooden spire
And a striking statue of St. George and the Dragon, sadly lost in a fire just 12 years after it opened. When Thomas caught wind of such an opulent, commanding building, he made sure to see what William could offer him, and unsurprisingly, he won.
The design proposed by Crossland was inspired by this building here, the Ypres Cloth Hall in Belgium. In 1999, it was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List as a monument to commerce, to ambition, and to a city that refused to be erased. Crossland's inspiration over a century before this was an intentional decision, no doubt, as Ypres is right in the middle of both Dunkirk and Roubaix, less than 50 kilometers from both towns. His team used a pseudonym, common practice in architectural competitions of the time. They went by Alpha, a bold display of confidence. Despite this, William Crossland made sure to maintain a healthy work-life balance. For when he received news of winning, he was off fishing in Nova Scotia, Canada. He later remarked that he was too preoccupied with salmon and moose to properly celebrate. Thomas was confident in the abilities of his new head architect, but nonetheless remained as restless as ever. He would visit the building site daily and inspect even the finest details. The two did grow close, however. Crossland later stated that one of Mr. Holloway's many traits was looking into everything which was going on. Eventually, however, it was completed. In 1885, Holloway Sanatorium was opened in Virginia Water. The breathtaking vision of William Crossland and meticulous attention to detail of Thomas Holloway was married into one building, and it was stunning. Thomas's aim to deliver a higher quality of care was also met. When the sanatorium opened, the Times described it as more like a luxury hotel than a hospital.
Not bad for a baker's son. But as we know, Thomas Holloway was not the sort of man to sit still. He had money left. He had time left. When Thomas turned his attention to the next great project, his first idea was to build a hospital for the incurably ill. But Jane had a different idea. Now remember, Jane wasn't just Thomas's wife. She was an integral business partner and present during many key decisions. Jane had spent decades alongside Thomas, watching their empire and their shared wealth grow. However, she did not have those same steely days exposed to the unfettered Rebasian capitalism. Jane watched on as Victorian society continued to reward only parts of the population, the wealthy and the men.
So women's rights were quite a lot more limited. They were restricted in terms of the property they could hold, and women did not have the vote. So, for the most part, women were excluded from political power. It was expected that they wouldn't work in serious professions, and there were many kind of spheres of work and life that were inaccessible to them.
She said that women were the greatest sufferers of all, held back from education, locked out of professions, unable, in many cases, to own property or even chart their own course. And so she made a simple yet radical proposition: a college for women. Now, this was 1871. Women could not vote, they could not graduate from universities like Oxford and Cambridge. The very idea of women's higher education was considered radical.
Things really were actually sort of starting to change from the mid-19th century onwards. And from that point, feminist campaigners started to campaign for education for women and for girls on the same terms as education that was being offered to boys at the same time.
And for Thomas, the ladies' university, much like the Sanatorium, had to act as its own advertisement. The showman, even in his most generous act, could not quite help himself. And he already knew exactly who would build it.
Thomas turned again to William Crossland, fresh from their collaboration on the Sanatorium, in fact, with a little bit of overlap. The same partnership, the same ambition, a tight-knit team. Thomas was in fact advised to hold another competition, which he of course ignored. William Crossland was the only man for the job.
But this time they wanted a different look. Unlike the Sanatorium, Crossland travelled to France to sketch the countryside chateau. One in particular stood out to him, and Thomas even made the journey to see it for himself. The Chateau de Chambord. And yet, before the plans could be seen to their end, before any of this became a reality, the woman who had pushed Thomas towards this college, who had replaced his modest plan with something radical, who had told him where his fortune needed to go, would never see it built. Thomas was devastated. He withdrew from his affairs almost entirely in the months that followed. The man who had never been able to sit still stopped. And Crossland suffered his own loss. Just 4 months after Jane, his wife, Lavinia, also died.
Two men, both grieving, both tasked with completing the grandest project that either of them had ever attempted in their lives, for a woman who would not live to see it.
And when the foundation deed was drafted, 8 years after Jane's death, on the 11th of October 1883, it named the college as a memorial to Jane, founded, in his own words, by the advice and counsel of the founder's dear wife, now deceased. But Thomas knew he had to deliver on that promise he made to his dear wife and business partner.
William Crossland later reflected on what it had been like to work for him. He said that Thomas Holloway was a client who sent him to school, a man who always worked with his head and never his heart.
Perhaps Thomas was never to work with his heart again. Still, construction began. Thomas visited the site 4 times in total. His health by now was failing. On one of those visits, he stood before what Crossland had built and said simply, "Well done, Mr. Crossland. I am more than pleased." This building, this castle, this monument was almost complete. Thomas's tribute to Jane and the culmination of his life's work was nearly there. An adventure spanning Europe and building a name across the world. But Thomas Holloway, too, would not be there to see it open.